In 2002, Oda published One Piece Databook Blue, but in the original Japanese print of this book, there is a segment where Oda talks about his personal interests, and in particular, about what is his favorite movie. What makes this part so interesting, however, is that Oda here reveals a potentially massive spoiler for the final saga, but more specifically, for the current Elbaf arc. Before revealing this spoiler, however, I first need to give you guys some context. Oda is actually a huge fan of cinema, but this goes right down to the ideas behind the Straw Hats. Sanji was originally based on Mr. Pink from Reservoir Dogs. Brook is all but confirmed to be based on Jack Skellington from Nightmare Before Christmas, and Frankie even has a scene where he impersonates the Terminator. Yet, as much as Oda likes taking cues from Western cinema, what he truly loves are Japanese films. Oda has in interviews said that both animated and live-action Japanese movies were a huge inspiration for his storytelling. You can for example see this in Oda facing all of the Admiral's designs on his favorite Japanese actors. There is however a very strong argument that, and I'm being very serious here, the entire basic concept of One Piece was inspired by movies from Japan. In particular, Oda in this interview mentions that what he absolutely loves are films about samurai. Some of you might be understandably surprised at this. After all, for Oda to be so inspired by samurai, it actually took decades for One Piece to introduce its version of the Bushi to the manga. There is however a very good reason why it took so long for this to happen. Oda has revealed that he had wanted to include Japanese icons like samurai and ninja in One Piece since the start, but that he deliberately held himself back, because for most of One Piece's early run, Naruto was still in serialization. Oda and Kishimoto are actually friends in real life, and because Naruto at this time was Japan's mainline manga for the country's iconic warriors, Oda did not want to steal any of Kishimoto's thunder. After Naruto ended in 2014, however, everything changed. In the last 10 years, Oda has let his love for his homeland loose, where One Piece has absolutely exploded with references to historical Japan. As pretty much all of you watching this video know, One Piece dedicated its longest arc to date to traditional Japanese culture, where the Wano arc is very much the Japan arc of the manga. But what a lot of fans may overlook is that Oda's fixation on depicting Japanese culture in One Piece did not stop at the Wano arc, but has continued on into the final saga. In the Egghead arc, when the transformations of the 5 elders were finally unveiled, the majority of them turned out to have powers of mythical creatures from Japanese folklore. The elders were characters One Piece had been building up for decades, but despite them all being based on historical non-Japanese leaders, Oda still decided to give most of them Japanese yokai powers. This trend continued in Elbaf, where for example, the story introduced the character of Kunko, who is not only one of the rare One Piece characters whose name is written in kanji, but Kunko's design is also very much that of a stereotypical Japanese sukeban girl. Just like the elders, Kunko is not just any random character, but a massively important player in the story's endgame, where in a recent poll I did on my channel, the majority thought that she as Imu's vessel was actually the most important character so far introduced in the final saga. The Elbaf arc's references to Japan do not however stop at Kunko, where very recently, multiple members of the legendary Rocks Pirates have also been revealed to draw their inspiration from the Yakuza, and in particular, how the Yakuza is depicted in Japanese film. But I think this connection between the Elbaf arc and Oda's favorite Japanese films is actually going to go even deeper. Despite this being an arc heavily based on Vikings and Northern Europe, I honestly think that Oda is once again going to use Japanese film as his main inspiration for Elbaf's plot. Not just any film, however, but one of Oda's absolute favorite films of all time. This is where I finally return to the potentially massive spoiler I mentioned in the very beginning of the video, where Oda in One Piece Databook Blue revealed that one of his favorite movies is 1954's Seven Samurai. Seven Samurai is a movie that tells a story of a feudal Japanese village that is being terrorized by bandits. At the beginning of the film, the villagers decide that they finally had enough and choose to hire samurai to save them from these bandits. The movie then proceeds to tell an over 3-hour-long epic story of the wandering samurai coming to the village and helping the locals finally defeat their oppressors. Based on this description alone, you can probably see why Oda likes this film so much. Several One Piece arcs follow this exact same story, where the Straw Hats come to a new island, find out that the locals are being terrorized by some villain, and Luffy then decides to help them. In the earlier databook excerpt I showed you, Oda absolutely gushes about the film, calling Seven Samurai a masterpiece, where he even has figures of the characters on display in his office. I actually rewatched this movie as research for this video, but now that I've gone through it, I think its impact on One Piece goes even beyond what Oda has publicly admitted. Just as an example, in the movie, the villagers actually don't have any money to give to the samurai, so they instead pay them in food. This is eerily like One Piece, where Luffy's reason for helping people he's only just met in several arcs also ends up being food. Another thing I noticed is that despite the movie's heavy subject matter of people starving and dying, Seven Samurai is also a story full of laughter, where there are so many scenes of the characters just deciding to laugh and joke, even though they are facing death. I don't think I need to tell any of you watching this video how similar this is to One Piece, as some of the most iconic moments of the story involve characters dying with a smile on their face. These could also just be me, but the visual image of the buried warriors at the end of the film also gave me the exact same feeling as how this same thing has been depicted in One Piece. Yet, despite all these similarities showing how big of an impact this movie has had on Oda, I do not actually think that One Piece has ever had an arc that truly retold this story. Even though the Straw Hats very often come to a new location and end up protecting the locals from evildoers, what we've always missed was what happened in the middle of this movie. After all of the samurai have been recruited and they come to the village, it is still weeks before the bandits themselves arrive, and the middle chapter of the movie is dedicated to the samurai preparing the village to defend themselves. The samurai train the locals how to fight, gather weapons, and create defenses around the area, all the while bonding with the villagers. The structure used by this movie has in the last 70 years become very popular, where it is even used by a lot of Western movies. Hollywood is actually full of films where the big climax is preceded by this getting ready to defend chapter. For a semi-recent example, this was basically the plot of the historical war movie Kung Fu Panda 3, which point by point goes through this plot of a village getting ready for battle. Despite how popular this structure is, and despite how much Oda adores this movie, I do not think One Piece has ever used this storyline in any of its arcs. When the Straw Hats come to a new island, they pretty much always fight a threat that is already there, with this in most cases being some tyrant who has been mistreating the locals for years. Even in arcs where the villains come to the island after the Straw Hats, things always escalate very quickly, where the Straw Hats fight the villains immediately without any preparation. In other words, this iconic middle chapter, where the heroes prepare to defend against the villains, is basically nowhere to be seen in any of One Piece's 113 volumes. I would even argue that this did not happen in the Wano arc. Kaido and his crew were already in Wano when the Straw Hats got there, and while Luffy and company did spend the beginning of the arc gathering their forces and preparing for war, Luffy's alliance in Wano actually played the role of the attackers, not the defenders, where they were the ones who ended up invading Kaido's island. So, even though One Piece has often come close, to this day, I do not think the manga has ever told the traditional Seven Samurai-like story, but I think we are being set up to finally see this happen in the Elbaf arc. The core idea of this current arc is that the giants have changed. Even though Elbaf used to be this famous land of warriors, the giants have recently become pacified and no longer see violence as the answer. The country has stopped training its children how to fight. The giants no longer hold the military power they used to, and Elbaf has very much tried to leave fighting in the past. This arc has however already given a lot of hints that the giants have made a mistake, and that before leaving the island, the Straw Hats will have to help them rediscover their warrior spirit. What the beginning of this arc has shown is that however noble their intentions, the giants changing their ways has left their country extremely vulnerable to being invaded. Within just a few hours, a handful of the world government's God's Knights have managed to throw the strongest nation in the world into complete chaos. Even the Knights themselves remark how shockingly easy this was, and that they're disappointed in how weak the giants have become. I think the true purpose of this part of the arc was to serve as a wake-up call to the giants, when even their children are being threatened, and even their mightiest warriors have been turned into the enemy's lapdogs. The Giants will likely realize that they were too naive, where their decision to become pacified simply led to outsiders taking advantage of the situation, and that Elbaf needs to relearn how to defend itself. If we compare this to the movie, what we've seen so far in Elbaf could very well be the first act of the Seven Samurai, where the villagers reach their breaking point and decide to fight back. What would then follow would be the second act I talked about before, where in this case, the Straw Hats would help the Giants train how to defend themselves. If we set the movie aside for a bit, there is already a lot of setup in the Elbaf arc itself, for the Straw Hats' role on this island being as teachers. The arc has so far put a lot of focus on Elbaf's kids and their education. There is a very noteworthy moment in the arc, where several pages are dedicated to the manga introducing all of the different children's names. This at the time was an incredibly random thing for the story to focus on, but I think it had a point. We later find out that there is a literal prophecy in the story about the Giants, where their allegiance is foretold to be a key factor in One Piece's final war. What this more than likely means for Luffy is that Elbaf will ally with him in this war, but what this also means is that the Giants will need to become significantly stronger to fulfill this prophecy. Essentially, I think all the pieces are there for Oda to finally recreate the storyline of his favorite movie. In this arc, Luffy may not just help the Giants to become warriors again, but the arc's climax could well be the Straw Hats and the Giants together defending Elbaf from an invasion. But here is my secret twist for this video. I do not think this climax is going to be against the world government. Even though the government is already on the island, I do not honestly think that Imu is set up to be the ultimate threat of this arc. The very simple reason for this is that Imu in his current state cannot give Luffy his next big fight in the story. Imu on Elbaf is in a temporary form, where he is possessing Kunko's body from half a world away, even though it is looking very likely that Luffy will soon fight this version of Imu. Imu here is nowhere near his full power, but also, Luffy cannot even truly beat him, as the real Imu is still in the Holy Land. This means that the fight between Luffy and Imu on Elbaf is at most only going to be another scuffle, similar to the ones Luffy had in the Egghead arc. In other words, while the characters will fight each other, neither Luffy or his opponent will be fully beaten. The story has also already established a mechanic for this fight between Luffy and Imu to be cut short, where we know from the previous arc that world government characters who travel via the magic circles can be sent back without being fully defeated. It is however extremely unlikely that a fight like this would suffice as the climax of the Elbaf arc. Elbaf is the famous land of warriors, an arc that has been built up for over 20 real-life years, and an arc that is already on its way to being one of the longest in all of One Piece. It has now also been over 100 chapters since Luffy defeated Kaido, which very likely means that Luffy's next full fight is right around the corner, as One Piece has never gone on for that long without giving Luffy one of his major fights. While it might sound crazy, what I personally think is that even with Imu on the island, this government incursion is only meant to be Elbaf's opening act. What I think is going to happen is that after defeating the God's Knights, the crew will actually stay on Elbaf instead of leaving the island. With all of the build-up for the Giants' allegiance in the final war, this could well be the moment where Elbaf officially becomes Luffy's territory, and the Straw Hats will help the Giants rediscover what it means to be warriors. Luffy has already shown how disappointed he is in this fabled land of warriors having gone soft, but he is very likely not just going to sit by and leave his territory defenseless. This was Luffy's whole view towards Wano country, where he was only willing to help the samurai if they were willing to stand up for themselves. If there is also one island Luffy is destined to inspire more than any other in the story, I think it is a fairly safe bet that this is going to be Elbaf. Not only has Luffy dreamed of coming to this island since the beginning of the Grand Line, but much more importantly, Elbaf is the one nation in the One Piece world that worships sun god Nika. The arc has also already set up this very challenge for Luffy, where the Giants still have to decide whether he as Nika is either a liberator or a destroyer. This is a bit of a side point, but with how much focus the arc has put on Elbaf's children, and them potentially needing to grow a lot stronger, I think it is very telling that the Straw Hats are right now traveling with a character whose powers literally allow people to grow up, where Bonnie could well have a big role to play in the rebirth of Elbaf's military. Granted, I think this would only be a self-defense, where I don't think Luffy will go full-on guard and turn Elbaf's youth into child soldiers. Now, let's say this all happens. Let's say the Straw Hats defeat the God's Knights, and the next part of the arc would be the crew helping the Giants prepare for war. If not the world government, who would actually be the ones to attack Elbaf? This is the part where I think I'm going to lose most of you, but I still think it is going to be the Big Mom pirates. The amount of evidence for the manga not being done with Big Mom and her crew is still to me at this point overwhelming. I'm not even joking, where even though she was already heavily linked with the Giants before this arc, the Elbaf arc has just kept on adding to this storyline, where Big Mom keeps being brought up by the Giants. We keep learning even more about her history with them, and she's even a huge part of this arc's flashback. The story also still clearly views her as one of the most important figures in the lore of One Piece, as Lin Lin was even included in the huge spread of all of God Valley's strongest characters together attacking Imu. Even after the God Valley part of this flashback is going to be over, however, Big Mom herself is not going to be going anywhere, as there is an entire upcoming storyline involving her, Lola and Loki that is still completely unexplored. But now, I have to push the brakes. This video is not really about Big Mom, but about the huge influence Japanese films have had on the One Piece story, and how this may be a huge inspiration for the Elbaf arc. Samurai movies may not be the first thing that come to mind when thinking about what story One Piece is going to tell in its Northern Europe arc. Still, as one final point for this video, if we just take out the samurai from this angle and focus on the more simple idea of locals having to defend themselves from invaders, this is actually a story this region of the world isn't unfamiliar with. If you still want to hear me talk about Big Mom's likely return, definitely click here for an older video, where I break down how Big Mom could have survived the events of Wano, but also how she could return stronger than ever by literally taking Kaido's soul. Thanks a lot to all members whose plunder fuels this channel. I don't know why, but I've gotten a lot of new members lately. As always, I am really grateful to all of you who watched this video to the end.